Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to the Leeds School of Architecture's Symposium 2020, Post-Pandemic Futures. I'm Senior Lecturer Craig Stott. So this is our first live event broadcast via Microsoft Teams, so I hope it goes smoothly for everyone, and you all get to see what is undoubtedly going to be 4 excellent and inspiring talks from the comfort of your own home. So what could be better? Now I'd like to just bring everyone's attention to the Q&A column, which you can see on the right hand side of your screen. You might have to choose it as an option at the top. I'd really like to encourage people to use this throughout the whole evening's event. So at any point, if you've got a question, please write it in there. We're going to monitor those, and at the end of each talk, we're going to have a question and answer session with each speaker, and then at the end, we're going to have a panel discussion between all 4 speakers. So I'm really looking forward to that, and I'm really looking forward to getting the questions and the responses to those that you put forward. So please use that throughout. As a starting point, I'd like to now introduce the Head of Architecture, Sarah Mills, who's going to say a few words to put this symposium in context with our wider school programme. So, Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Craig. So welcome and thank you for joining us for this symposium organised and hosted by Leeds School of Architecture. The school delivers courses in architecture, interior architecture, landscape architecture and urban design, and interdisciplinary events such as this are a way for our students, staff, associates, professionals and friends to come together to question what architecture can contribute to the world we live in, from a cultural, social, political and technological points of view. The Leeds School of Architecture's Technical Symposium is the first in a series of interdisciplinary open events taking place over 5 consecutive Wednesday evenings. Next Wednesday, the 18th of November at 5 o'clock is the start of our open lecture series, Fortuitous Encounters, with guests Mike Rusham of Burt's Portsmouth Rustham and Tahir Amin of Group Work. I hope you can join us. Thank you very much, Craig.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks very much. So we'd also like to take this opportunity to announce the latest winners of the Leeds Beckett Photography Society Prize, which is currently presided over by one of architecture's very own second-year students, Emily King. I've been really impressed with the images that I've seen so far on Instagram that have been submitted, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the rest of the winners. So, Emily, over to you.
Yeah, good evening. I apologise, my voice is a bit croaky as I've got a cold. I'm Vice President of the Leeds Beckett Photography Society, and we have recently joined up with the Leeds School of Architecture to bring you this BA Architecture competition, photography competition.
Emily, I think you might be on mute. If you just... There we go.
Good evening. I apologise, my voice is a little croaky as I've got a cold. I'm Vice President of the Leeds Beckett Photography Society, and we've recently joined up with the Leeds School of Architecture to bring in this BA Architecture Photography competition. So it's been really successful and we've had a lot of very beautiful entries. It was really nice to see such a range of inspiring images, and I'm sure you'll all agree. It was very interesting to see what the students at Leeds Beckett consider architecture photography as well. So I'm proud to announce the winners. So the first year winner is Jessica Aneen. The second year winner is Habib Sadat. The third year winner is Hazel Rutherford. And these are the 6 runners up. All 9 of you will receive a certificate, hopefully in the week to come. And you'll put your pictures, the winning pictures will be posted on the social media for the Photography Society and Leeds School of Art. 3 winners will win a prize, and that should be given to you next week if we can do that. So It was really exciting to see what you're all kind of getting up to, and I hope we can bring you more competitions like this again. If you didn't win this time, don't let it stop you from entering again, because the standard was really high and it was really tough to decide. So thank you for all your contributions, and thank you, Carla, for the idea really and helping to judge the winners. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Need to unmute my microphone as well. Some really great work there, and congratulations to all the winners. Yeah, I think there's some really good stuff, and I'd encourage everybody actually to try and follow our social media streams. So there's a few on Instagram. There's the School of Architecture, there's the Leeds School of Arts, there's a Project Office one, there's an interior architecture, a landscape architecture, some amazing student work being put out there. So please follow our Instagram, Facebook accounts and Twitters. That'd be really good. So moving on to tonight's main event, the Leeds School of Architecture's Technology Symposium 2020 Post-Pandemic Futures. Tonight we've got 4 presentations for you, all world leaders in their field. It's absolutely amazing that we've got this caliber of speaker with us tonight, and I'm really, really excited. Each presenter was asked to respond to the provocation that as the rate of technological change accelerates following the COVID-19 pandemic, what is the architect's role in designing the future cities post-pandemic under the shadow of irreversible climate change? I'm genuinely excited to hear these talks, so let's get on with it. And to do that, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague, Nick Tyson, to introduce each of the speakers. Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Craig. Hello, everyone. I'll extend that welcome as well to this symposium, and I'm going to very briefly introduce the first speaker. It's Ihab Saeed. I'm really pleased he can join us from Biome. Biome's a multi-award-winning research and development-led biomanufacturing company, so really interesting mix of elements there. They allow nature to lead innovation, aiming to revolutionise construction and create a healthier, more sustainable built environment. So I'm going to hand over to Ihab, who's going to run through things in a lot more detail and fill you in on what and how they work. Thanks very much. Over to you, Ihab.
Hello, everyone. Hoping you can all see my screen. Right, good evening everyone. I'm Ihab Saeed and I'm the founder and director of innovation at Biome. I'm also a PhD researcher at Northumbria University. Today, I'd like to talk about how nature can inspire us all to revolutionize industry and restore local equity in the built environment. But first, I think it is now clearer than ever that our capitalist economies are simply not working. And most importantly, they're not working for the majority of the world's population. The pandemic has revealed multiple flaws in our current systems. It also showed us that capital can be made available in the blink of an eye to support those with power and influence. By being forced to stop almost everything and stay home, we started to collectively and critically question our consumption habits, our production practices, and the way we do business. We look around us and we see that we have contributed to a planet in pain, characterized by the scars we've left upon the geology of the Earth, as well as the onset of the 6th great extinction. This has become known as the Anthropocene. Whilst we once lived our lives as part of the natural world, the world we've built for ourselves is marked by a form of extraction and consumption that is changing the world around us. The land, the air, the water is saturated with pollution, and the world is hotter than it has been for 120,000 years. With the population of the planet predicted to increase by nearly 40% in the next few decades, the demands placed upon our world have far exceeded the point of sustainability. If the combined infrastructure plans of growing and developing economies are ever to be realized, we will need a further 7 planets worth of resources. But in nature, everything is in constant flow, constant circulation, with outputs from one process becoming the inputs for others. Left to its own devices, nature manages resources in a highly efficient and balanced manner, ensuring equilibrium is achieved in all its ecosystems. Biomimetics is not a simple imitation of natural form, but it is a deep understanding of biological processes and systems that leads to a set of principles which can be extracted and implemented in man-made technologies. The science of biomimetics is driven by the realization that our most prized inventions exist in more elegant, eco-sensitive, efficient, and effective forms in nature. The construction of lily pads, for example, makes our infrastructure seem underwhelming, and our air conditioning technologies and HVAC systems just can't compete with the way termite mounds passively control and maintain exact temperatures throughout the year, by building intelligence into their design and using appropriate materials. An in-depth and holistic understanding of how organisms can achieve such feats of engineering, we can shed light on how we can solve some of the world's most pressing challenges. As we move towards relying more on biology as opposed to technology when solving our problems, we find that we use much less energy, less resources, and more structure, more information, and with the advances in technology, computing, and as we're currently gathering enormous amounts of data left, right, and center, we can now mimic nature in ways we could have only imagined. By taking inspiration from nature, we can move away from an extract, make, use, and dispose linear economy, which has a tremendous negative impact on the environment and our health, to one that is circular, where we ethically source, reuse, or recycle existing resources in our economy and consider the environmental, socio-ethical, and economic impact of a material or product's entire life cycle. And that's exactly what we do at Biome, a research and development-led company that places biological systems at the heart of its inspiration. We're aiming to revolutionize construction and the way we do business, and we're achieving this through our bio-based materials, construction systems, and a range of services. We're starting with the most tangible and immediate of those offerings, and that's our materials. ORB, or organic refuse biocompound, is a semi-structural sheet material made entirely out of food and agricultural waste and contains a 100% natural binder that we've developed. It is currently available for use in interior architecture and will soon be available for dry lining in buildings. It outperforms other wood-based sheet materials when it comes to mechanical strength. It is carbon negative, does not contain any synthetic chemicals or toxins, and is highly price competitive. ORB is currently being developed into a plant-based concrete, which should be a serious game changer. Our plant-based concrete will be available within the next 2 or 3 years. We also work with one of nature's most wondrous organisms, mushrooms. We use the root systems, or the vegetative part of a mushroom, to consume a variety of organic and synthetic waste, and the outcome is one of the world's most advanced building insulation materials. We've developed biologically unique species of mycelium, and we've naturally accelerated their evolution to favor particular traits that would improve their mechanical and physical properties, and we trained them to consume a variety of waste streams. We're currently testing our mycelium insulation against industry standards with the Building Research Establishment and the British Board of Agrimont, and we've been blown away by how we managed to achieve thermal conductivity values as low as 0.024, which may not mean very much to most people, but it competes with market-leading synthetic insulation, and in some cases it is 2 to 3 times the thermal insulation values of commonly used alternatives. It is naturally fire resistant due to the chitinous nature of mycelium. When tested for heat of combustibility, we found that in the event of a fire in a building that uses mycelium insulation, the fire would spread at around half the speed when compared to all other insulation products. For VOCs, or volatile organic compounds, which are released by materials throughout their life and affect the indoor air quality and therefore our health and well-being, we achieved the highest possible score of A+, making it one of the healthiest materials available. No synthetic coatings or additives and no chemicals, outperforming almost all other insulation products on the market by simply using nature's genius. Now, last year we had an interesting little discovery in our R&D lab. which led us onto a super exciting journey. You may be aware of mycelium's remediation capabilities, known as mycoremediation, which is a process by which fungi produces appropriate enzymes that break down complex compounds like plastics. They break them down into hydrocarbons and carbon dioxide. We've discovered last year that we've developed mycelium strains that are capable of consuming plastic. The rate of degradation that we were able to achieve was quite significant, and that was quite the revelation. Last year, the Onion Collective, a social enterprise at the vanguard of social action and community business, joined forces with Biome, and we were awarded the Waitrose Plant Plastic Prize to continue to develop this research further and ensure that such technologies have a transformational impact on local communities. This has allowed us to carry out numerous experiments over the last year, where we continue to evolve our strains through a non-intrusive and non-GMO process known as directed evolution, which basically mimics the process of natural evolution in an accelerated lab environment. This has resulted in the development of 3 strains that can successfully consume PU, polyurethane, and PE, polyethylene, which are found in everything from your kettle and toaster to clothes, bottles, and furniture. And unlike other plastic recycling processes, which can propagate the current plastic crisis, encouraging the production of more plastics, our process assimilates or eliminates plastic completely. And all outputs, such as the non-toxic hydrocarbons, are stored in the resulting mycelium material, which in itself is a replacement for plastic and other damaging materials. And the carbon dioxide is turned back into oxygen through the process of photosynthesis and fed back into our incubation space, providing fresh, oxygen-rich air to the next batch of mycelium, ensuring a completely closed loop in our manufacturing process and resulting in the production facility effectively being a carbon sink. Although our mycelium insulation, which is currently available, is grown on organic substrates, we aim to eventually integrate plastics and other synthetic waste streams from construction, fashion, and other sectors into our production process. When working with natural materials, it is essential to ensure the appropriate construction systems are used to maintain the building's breathability and end-of-life circularity, or even biodegradability. So although our materials are designed to be seamlessly integrated into current practice, we've developed Triagamy, an interlocking construction system that combines all of our materials and is inspired by the way carbon molecules bond to one another. It does not require any permanent binders or fasteners, and it creates robust structures that can be deconstructed at any stage of their life. That allows buildings to grow and shrink and adapt to the needs of its occupants and local community. Architects can design any floor plan and still only use our 21 unique components. It reduces build times by 95%, build costs by 70%, and the environmental impact by a staggering 120%. It is patented in all continents in almost 60 countries, and we aim to launch Triagamy with our plant-based concrete in around 2 or 3 years from now. Due to the vast environmental benefits and global potential of our technologies, it was essential for us to deliver this to the world in a way that is ethical, equitable, and sensitive to our current economic landscape at a time where it is needed the most. So we're setting up the world's first community-led biomanufacturing facility with the Onion Collective. Apart from being the first large-scale facility to produce mycelium insulation, another unique aspect of this collaboration is in the way it acts as a catalyst for regeneration within a community. Again, taking inspiration from nature, we've developed a business model that allows communities to drive industry in quite a revolutionary way that ensures the regeneration of the local community, environment, and economy. Here you can see us standing in one of the last remaining buildings on the site of a paper mill, which was the beating heart of the local economy in Watchet, West Somerset. For 200 years, the paper mill recycled old clothes and other materials into paper, creating a thriving industry in Watchet. But on Christmas Eve in 2015, the mill shut its doors, almost overnight, taking with it almost 200 jobs and leaving the town in a very difficult situation. We're taking the mill's heritage into the future by using one of the last remaining buildings to build our biomanufacturing facility, which will be known as Biomill Watch It, and through an ongoing profit share, gradually restore social equity and transform the local economy. As with everything we do, we take inspiration from nature. We can start to map out the major industries as a collection of systems, each containing agents that are capable of influencing their systems. Having an in-depth biomimetic understanding of the way our systems are linked and the role of every agent within each system, we can start to predict how a step change within an industry or an economy can take place. And it is this level of systems thinking inspired by nature that will allow us to work towards a more equitable and compassionate economy, which pushes the boundaries of the circular economy. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation diagram of the circular economy, showing how technical materials and biological materials need to be kept separate when circulated within industry. For us, we believe we can take this a step further. Technical materials, although can be recycled and circulated within industries, still contribute to excessive energy consumption and harmful chemicals and toxins. So as we've proven that 100% natural bio-based materials are not only capable of competing with technical materials, but can even outperform them, we need to start shrinking our technical material circles and grow the biological ones, as our materials can be indefinitely recirculated and only have a positive impact at every stage of their life. And that's for the industrial economy, but we need to expand the circles even further. We need to consider the financial economy, which more or less dictates the world we live in. If we look at how our financial economy currently operates, we will see that value is created and extracted in quite a linear and inequitable manner. We have large groups of people building value, yet only the few at the top reap the true reward, indirectly extracting and exploiting the collective value created. Whenever we look at statistics on wealth per capita in countries around the world, we often see something that looks like this. But due to the distribution of wealth within these countries being incredibly skewed towards a very small number of people, we end up with a very inaccurate representation of our economy. Watch It is the perfect example of how a community can severely lose out to a prevalent economic system, where the average annual income per household is around £16,000. By expanding the circles into the financial economy to recirculate value and wealth where it is being created, we can create a symbiotic relationship between community and industry and enable communities to regenerate themselves much like in nature. And we don't stop there. The entire ecosystem needs to be considered. Governments with policies and legislation, academia with knowledge and resources, and large multinationals with major economic power and market control, they all play a critical part of the change. By aligning the incentives, motives, needs, and offerings of the various stakeholders, new ways of doing business and new economies start to emerge. Our first biomanufacturing facility is almost completely built in Watch It, West Somerset, and it will start by the end of this year, producing up to 3,000 square meters of insulation panels, around 20 homes worth per month. And over the next couple of years, will eventually be scaled up to provide enough insulation for 120 homes each month. At that scale, we would be using up around 240 tons of waste and sequestering around 30 tons of carbon each month. That's the work of about 19,000 trees a month. It would provide over 30 new local jobs, and through the equitable distribution of profits, provide a constant income for the community, allowing them to invest in their education, infrastructure, and social action projects. We're also working with the YMCA to set up the second facility in Newcastle by the end of 2021, and have been invited to set up facilities by governments around the globe. Along with government support, we're working with more than 10 of Europe's top universities, some of the world's largest multinationals, and have been awarded and recognized by our work by national and international bodies. We're working towards a biomimetic future that will allow us to make leaps in the fight against the climate crisis, equitably distributing wealth and showcase a new global economy that benefits from global interconnectedness and the sharing of knowledge, but works with more reliable local supply chains and empowers local communities. A biomimetic future will help us save time and costs. It will allow us to be more resource and energy efficient, and at a time of climate crisis where sustainability is simply not enough, it will drive us to venture beyond sustainability and into regeneration so that we can start healing. And most importantly, it will allow us to look after our psychological and physiological well-being so that we can be that species that healed the planet that they almost lost. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Ihab. That was absolutely fascinating, and I'd just like to say it was really interesting to see the kind of scope of your thinking, actually, from working with the sort of minutiae, the detail, if you like, going to and connecting that to kind of global issues, including our economies as well. Whilst I'm waiting for a few questions just in from the live event Q&A, I just hoped you might answer one of mine. So I'm sorry to sort of step in and hog it for a little while I wait for some questions. But I was keen to know how some of your projects come about, and whether they're sort of developed in a kind of a lab-based situation or in a workshop, and then how they're kind of tested in a kind of live arena. I realise you sort of touched upon this in different projects. Sure. But I was quite interested in the kind of process that you work in, basically. Yeah.
We've got two different approaches to how we look to solve a problem that arises, or how we can take a technology from nature and bring it into industry. And we call them really top-down or bottom-up. When we look at the top-down solutions, they're more challenges or problems that we realize in the industry or in a particular manufacturing process or a construction method. And we try to then find solutions or approaches that can solve it through using nature-inspired design. That usually takes place starting in a design studio or a workshop. When it starts to become much more technical, then lab tests starts to take place, and then it starts to become tested in a more of a real-life situation. With bottom-up solutions, that starts in the lab, where we actually just explore organisms, explore different ways of doing things, look at how organisms on a microscopic scale are able to solve some of their problems or achieve incredible feats of engineering. And what we do is then we take that, bring it into the design studio, and from the design studio into a real life scenario. So I think it's essential to have all those areas working together, and to have designers, architects and engineers working collaboratively with chemists and physicists and biologists, as well as people from law backgrounds and business backgrounds. It's that kind of truly interdisciplinary approach that makes sure that the end solution is incredibly well conceived.
Yes, brilliant. Yeah, I'm just trying to imagine what kind of place you work in, because it's I can imagine it's quite varied.
Well, yeah, I showed a little video of Zoe Laughlin when she filmed the BBC documentary, and when she visited, she described it quite well. She was like, this is a bit of a mashup of a kitchen, a lab, a workshop, a design studio, and a farm. And I think it's mixing all those different areas and sectors together is what's needed really when you're taking this approach.
Yes, I think so. Just to cover the kind of scope, and it's not just the people, but it's also the places. Places of work, if you like, or laboratories, workshops, and also live projects. It's quite interesting how your projects start quite speculatively. Is it something that you generate or look for, or do you kind of get a knock on the door, so to speak, and say, could you take a look at this? And how do you generate your work? Is the next question that I'd like to.
Yeah. So far, it's been very much research driven. So I spent a couple of years doing some really in-depth research into the waste streams in the UK, focusing mostly on construction, looking at what the challenges are within the industry, and then understanding that the materials are at the core of a lot of the challenges that come up, like embodied and operational carbon and energy, and the waste as well. So it's it has been to this point very much research driven, so identifying where the challenges are through primary research as well as also looking at the literature. But I think moving forward as well, we're going to start doing a lot of work that is much more on the speculative side, where it's just sort of exploratory in the lab. We're just exploring an organism or an approach or a biological process, and then learning what technology we can derive from that to solve a problem that exists in the industry.
Yeah, excellent. I'm just going to put a couple of other questions coming in here. I'll give you the compliments as well. Brilliant talk.
Thank you.
The question that follows that is how do you deliver on the political and economic restructuring that you challenge? So I think that's quite an interesting point actually, because it's clearly quite a challenging rethink from our sort of very linear based economy to much more kind of inclusive, socially inclusive and a kind of a circle economy as well. Yes, how do you challenge that? It's a really interesting question. How do you get that into a political arena, I guess, is the question.
Absolutely. I think that's a really great question, because often it's really easy to get really bogged down into sort of tunnel vision on what you're focusing on, what you're developing, and really just focus on developing the most incredible material. But what we must always realize is those materials are going to exist within construction methods, construction systems, which are then going to exist within business models, within industries, within sectors, within economies. And we have to take, you know, a very sort of primitive nature-inspired approach where when an organism is introduced into an ecosystem, that ecosystem is usually the perfect environment for that organism to emerge, or for that mutation to occur. And if that organism then continues to live and thrive, that means the ecosystem is perfect for it. And we have to take that same approach when we're developing and launching new products and new materials and new technologies, especially when we're at such a challenging time. We've got a pandemic, a climate crisis. We really need to consider the full economic landscape within which we're operating. Our director of operations, for example, used to be a risk manager managing multi-billion-pound projects in the Ministry of Justice, and has a background in sustainable development. We've also got members of the team that have backgrounds in policies and also challenging regulations and looking at how we can change policies. And that's a really important part of what we're doing, because on a very technical side, when we're actually collecting a waste stream, we're not really a waste management firm, and we're not really just a material developer or a design studio. We're kind of all of those. And the current regulations, the current policies are set out and laid out for companies that are very, one-directional or one-dimensional in their approach. So we need to start lobbying and start encouraging more policies in a very ethical and a very gentle way. And I think the media is really supporting that kind of push and that kind of change in political views. And also the circumstances that we're in, with more documentaries shedding light on the climate crisis, and the pandemic itself has really showed that we really need a complete system change, a complete transformation in the way that we run our economy. So it's definitely much easier to have this conversation now than it would have been about 10 years ago.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that's I think just it's interesting that you're able to kind of put that back into a much broader context, because I think it's something as designers we find quite difficult to kind of get our work into another kind of arena, and because yours is so connected to this idea of economy, I think it's incredibly important that you've managed to sort of forge those connections as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just having a last little look through, but we can probably draw some of the questions to a close if that's okay. You have,
of course.
I just want to check I haven't missed anything. Just a second, and then we'll hand over. Sorry about this. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to just end the show now. We'll move to the next presenter. We seem to have a small technical fault with Helene, and I'm hoping Rachel would be able to take the next call. It's slightly out of the order advertised, But Rachel, if you're okay to do that, yeah, great. While we just sort out a technical issue with Helene. So I'm going to introduce, just one second, the next speaker. So we have Professor Rachel Armstrong from Newcastle University. Rachel leads the experimental architecture group who investigate new approaches to living building materials. It's a synthesis that occurs between these systems and their inhabitants. It's denoted as living architecture. And I'll hand over to Rachel to explain in much more detail and show some of her work. And we'll catch up again at the QA at the end, Rachel. Thank you very much. I'll now make your screen live, and if you're ready to present, brilliant. And the content's now live. Thank you. Sorry, Rachel, we're just having a sound issue.
Are we good now?
Yes, you're live now.
We share our world with many others, not always equitably, and the quest for disease control has been the subject for many scholars since ancient times. Our modern view of contagion arose in 1861, when Louis Pasteur published his germ theory. By 1865, he had proved the link between germs and disease, becoming a household name. My slides are not advancing, so I'm let me just see if I can do something about that. Is there just a delay, or? Okay, let's see if that works. Okay, right. I'll start from the beginning. So we share our world with many others, not always equitably, and the quest for disease control has been the subject for many scholars since ancient times. Now, a modern view
Sorry, Rachel, your desktop has disappeared. Would you mind resharing it?
Okay. Okay.
The beauty of digital events.
So it seems to be a balance between having control of my slides. So let's have a look at this, see if this works. We should be here. Am I advancing? Okay, if I press this, can you still hear me?
Yeah, so far so good, and that's advancing. Great, thanks, Rachel.
Okay, well, I'll just go back a couple of slides just to keep the narrative going. So we're sharing our world with many others, not always equitably, and the quest for disease control has been the subject for many scholars since ancient times. And a modern view of contagion arose in 1861 when Louis Pasteur published his germ theory. By 1865, he proved the link between germs and disease, becoming a household name. From this point onwards, in the popular imagination, microbes were regarded as carriers of disease and bad for our health. Responding with the construction of germ-free environments, architecture embraced the reign of hygiene, characterized by modern plumbing and easy to wipe white shiny surfaces that afforded the relentless pursuit of cleanliness to rid our homes and cities of terrible infections like cholera and typhoid. Idealizing the idea of environmental sterility, Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy in Poissy, which is just outside Paris, was built between 1929 and 31 in the wake of the Spanish flu pandemic. A wash basin stands in the center of the entrance hall like an altar as a prayer to hygiene, prompting visitors to wash their hands as soon as they arrive and symbolizing a new era of cleanliness. The novelty of modern plumbing and spaces that spotlight dirt have largely receded into the everydayness of our hygiene customs in an era where antibiotics and kitchen products are designed to kill all known germs dead, comforting us with the promise of a world where no pathogen is unconquered. Out of the Anthropocene's cauldron of air pollution, animal welfare abuses, urban overcrowding and international travel, steps COVID-19. This novel coronavirus, a highly contagious type of human and animal pathogen originating in bats, is a deadly new neighbour, spreading through respiratory droplets and direct contact, where it can also be indirectly acquired through shared surfaces like door handles. It moves rapidly through cities, mutating and shape-shifting as it goes, maintaining its pathogenicity. From its origin in the mines of Mojiang in April 2019 and onto the wet markets of Wuhan around November 2019, this deadly new RNA virus has infected nearly 50 million people and claimed the lives of over 1.2 million. So how should we respond? Our first instincts are to increase environmental sterility. International governments concentrate on the specific biological details of the pathogen by developing vaccines that break transmission chains via herd immunity. We play our part by wearing face masks, reaching for hand sanitizers in public spaces, and learning once again how to properly wash our hands. But is better and more sterility the right approach to combating infectious disease in the 21st century? Well, the immediate answer is yes. It is right that we take responsibility for our role in the transmission of the virus to prevent its immediate spread. But we should also address the environmental root causes of infection, where our own expansion into the new spaces precludes room for others, thereby setting biological conflict in motion. An alternative approach to the presence of microbes and being at war with them is needed to establish a new livability. Such a possibility is already here. Following advances in biotechnology at the turn of the millennium, the emerging science of metagenomics enabled us to suddenly see microbes in their ecosystems within our personal spaces and habitats. Now, while piecemeal, this view was revelatory, as our understanding of how microbes shaped our lives changed overnight. The greatest revelation was the human microbiome, the collection of all the microorganisms living in association with the human body, which revealed the extent of our dependency on microbes for our proper functioning. Now, although microbes are part of the microbiome, they sit outside of biology and are not, technically speaking, alive. However, they are incorporated into us much more deeply than other microbial agents such as bacteria, archaea, protists and fungi, transforming us from within our tissues by modifying our genetics even when there are no symptoms of disease. Changing what it means to be human, people are no longer pure human bodies, but are already always entangled with many microbial others. Most of these kin are commensals. Some are symbiotic, and around 1,400 total potential members of the human microbiome are pathogens. Now, while this sounds like a large number, they actually account for much less than 1% of all the microbial species on the planet. Shifting the blame from our own responsibility for environmental disequilibrium onto voiceless others, the antimicrobial approach maintains the status quo. But by embracing our microbiota and our identity as holobionts, where our proper functioning is irreducibly entangled with our microbial others, we can take new action and responsibility that enables us to design the spaces of greatest potential transmission differently. Spending 90% of our daily activities within indoor spaces, we are important dispersal vectors that maintain, disseminate, and even propagate the activity of microbes all around us. The main places for contracting an infection are home, the workplace, public transport, social gatherings and restaurants, which account for 90% of all transmission events. It should therefore come as no surprise that all surfaces have characteristic microbiota, which make up the microbiome of the built environment. And while our knowledge of this microbial commons, the shared set of microbial goods all around us, is incomplete, It is modifiable by ventilation systems, surfaces and moisture, forming part of the strategy for responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Making space for others through active engagement with the microbial commons generates sites for negotiation and exchange to establish conditions of mutual co-inhabitation. In the immediate term, appropriate design of indoor spaces can break transmission chains, as people are 20 times more likely to contract the virus in indoor spaces. The critical change in attitude between an invasive microbial disease and our participation in designing the microbiome is the degree of responsibility we hold, both in the sense of addressing human wrongdoings that cause imbalance, but also in identifying the limits of our coexistence with microbial systems. Now, to activate the microbial commons within our living spaces, rather than trying to work with microbes in their distributed form, we must actually make space for them, focusing on cultivating those species whose transactions we seek as domestic companions. This means we need to make microbial homes within our own homes for them. The 2011 microbial home concept by Philips Design adopted a systemic approach to microbial activity by imagining the home as a biological machine that filtered, processed and recycled household waste to generate a range of biological activities that performed various functions, such as domestic beekeeping to bioluminescent lighting, biogas-powered cookers from kitchen compost, and gardens that decompose plastic waste. So moving from the concept to the prototype, the Living Architecture project advanced the idea of the microbial home by concentrating desired microbial species within an optimized site through the construction of ideal homes for microbes. Integrated into a bioprocessor wall, cultivated microbes performed housework in exchange for liquid waste, namely urine and grey water. Composed of 3 different microbial bricks, namely the microbial fuel cell, an algae photobioreactor, and a synthetic consortium bioprocessor, they were assembled as programmable metabolic apps, which generated a cyclical economy of matter powered by different metabolisms. Living architecture also has the power to interrupt microbial transmission chains within indoor spaces, where, rather than humans outsmarting microbes, established microbes are brought into proximity with microbial others. And this is how. A particularly interesting observation, explored since an early stage in the development of the project, is the ability of microbial fuel cells to kill disease-causing pathogens in their feedstock. Demonstrated by the University of the West of England through the removal of hepatitis B and other pathogens from waste streams, early findings are not only a novel breakthrough for the sanitation sector, but also create opportunities for regulating the microbiome of the built environment by acting like an external immune system. Fed with waste from our bodies, our natural microbiota and any pathogens that enter into the bioprocessor complex, where they are either incorporated into the anaerobic biofilm of the microbial fuel cell and they become functionally integrated into the apparatus, or they're removed. So once a person's communities of microbiota and biomolecules have entered the living architecture system, they can be used for health monitoring more generally. So with its integrated, cybernetically organized systems of artificial intelligence, sensors, microbial actors, and robotic actuators, living architecture provides a programmable infrastructure for managing our individual and collective health within indoor spaces. So a new near future scenario within a building is that on the detection of pathogens, the activation of artificial intelligence and robotic actuators takes place. Now this will turn on air conditioners and operate an early warning system that implements an institutionally determined protocol for containment of the outbreak. And since the sensors can also read your body, These responses can be tailored to your needs and vulnerabilities. Elders may need highly sensitive and metabolically diverse screening systems, while the young may benefit from early exposure to specific allergens to build up the health of their immune systems. So even with such complex apparatuses to help us negotiate the microbial commons, our trust in microbial others will not be established overnight. And containment of the unruly microbes that bring infectious disease is only possible when people stop acting individually and collectively adopt fundamentally ethical behaviours within a geography of awareness that appreciates how our actions circulate between people and all kinds of others. Negotiated forms of peace with the more than human realm includes the development of architectural immune systems that provide access to an interspecies language commons. Since most non-humans do not have an audible language, reaching microbes on their own terms involves a certain sense of displacement and discomfort, as meaningful events are always already compromised by the nature of our mutually receptive capacities. Ways of understanding the other are not channeled through discrete sensory systems uniquely designed for this purpose, and are therefore experienced in a diffuse manner through a range of weak modalities, rendering these exchanges intensely environmental. Using microbial metabolism, data, bioprocessor systems, artificial intelligence, low-power electronics and digital displays, the ALICE project makes sense of these parameters using the microbial fuel cell platform from the Living Architecture project to establish a biodigital interface and an augmented reality communication system that helps people acknowledge, engage meaningfully, and even negotiate their relationships with the invisible worlds of microbes around them. Rendering obsolete instrumental practices, microbes housed in these nurturing apparatuses are not enslaved, but establish themselves within preferred bioreactor types to make kin and community through the production of microbial consortia and biofilms. When, through habituation, the overall performance and well-being of the constituents cannot be meaningfully separated out from each other, they become a designed holobiont. A version of this relationship was developed in the installation 999 years, 13 square meters, The Future Belongs to Ghosts, a collaboration between me and Cecile B. Evans in 2019 for the Whitechapel Gallery's group exhibition, Is This Tomorrow? Exploring the possibility of a post-human apartment powered by microbes, the apparatus is haunted by digital figures or ghosts from the past, present and future, with vague memories of the humans that set them in motion, comprising a post-human household. No aspect of working with microbiomes at any scale is fully resolved, and holobiontic living raises pressing and broader questions about the construction of architectural immune systems that enable negotiating spaces within the microbial commons to establish a parliament of things that recognises the agency of non-humans. Since our mutual coexistence can never be taken for granted, effective interface design not only enables us to establish relationships with non-human others, but it's also critical for maintaining a practice of care through the rituals of space making. In an age of antibiotic resistance, environmental poisons and climate crisis, we are all part of an ongoing biological immune surveillance complex that is informed by our conduct as more than human holobiont and ecosystem. To date, this has not been consciously designed beyond the established conventions of pandemic etiquette focused on the transmission of viruses alone, rather than the prevention of new zoonoses and the spatial systems that offer those affordances which promote good behaviour. While the first probiotic Villa Savoy does not yet exist, it will likely be very different than Corbusier's sterile machine promoting space, packed with tubes, fluids and organs for culturing particular kinds of microbes. These liquid infrastructures will shape how we live. Such a construction is fundamentally messy, leaky, entangled with its inhabitants and irrepressibly living. reeking of diversity, inclusivity and diplomacy. The value frameworks that inform our care for these spaces shape our ethics, economies, alter biopolitics and longer term relationship with nature, help us establish a microbiotic parliament. But these spatial practices are no utopia. They are a hard-fought evolutionary Babel, where at any time the complex tower of relationships that enable human life on Earth may collapse. This complex process can only be read as a function of deep time, when necessarily it exceeds a single person's lifetime. Whether we like it or not, visibly or invisibly, habitually or belligerently, COVID-19 has already changed us. We may just not know it yet. Notions of getting back to normal will have invisible new baselines where all the little changes set in motion by COVID-19 add up to shape our psyche, behaviour, culture, our tissues and the physicality of our species. At first, these adaptations may seem reactive or temporary, but as they persist, they'll become a familiar part of us. Even when the present pandemic has passed, new zoonoses arising from animal species that we've subordinated and abused will be unleashed from their host reservoirs to change us again. Each successive wave of trauma and response will alter the baselines of our identity. Each time we will seek to reassure, redefine and reinvent what it means to be human. And we will continue to do so until the question itself becomes irrelevant.
Thanks very much, Rachel. That was fascinating. If you don't mind staying on screen for a little while, I'd like to just field a couple of questions, if that's okay. I think, firstly for me, I think you absolutely extended the toolkit available to us as designers, as thinkers, as architects, right down to a kind of biological toolkit, which is kind of news to me in some ways. I kind of work with stuff all the time, and I hadn't really thought of it in this way. And you described this idea of kind of microbiotic kind of landscape, if you like, and what I'm interested in is how you start to think about that in spatial terms as well, because I think what's fascinating is this kind of range and scope of your work. Perhaps you could say a little bit about how you think that might affect. You mentioned, for instance, the home. Yep. is one kind of environment that we occupy quite a lot of our time at the moment, but also how this might affect public space as well, and the realm of the city. So how do you foresee this kind of microbiotic landscape kind of affecting our spatial design?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a really important and exciting one, and it's to do with the question of scale. You know, having worked with a lot of laboratory environments, one of the big questions that is always presented and is well, so you're working with tiny little things, what does that actually mean for human experience? What's really interesting about the microbiotic landscapes is that actually it is at the human scale, and that scale is the body. So we can actually start to think of these invisible microbial landscapes through the relationship with our own bodies in the spaces through which we are already familiar, but we detail them differently, we read them differently, we engage different kinds of technologies and different spatial tactics and protocols to encourage, let's say, new bodily relationships, new bodily habituses. And so if we think through the body, we actually have something that's quite tangible. So, the handprints on the wall, the spaces that we touch, let's call it the activity of daily life that shapes a temporal based, let's say, fabric, like a snail. As we trail through our environment, we're kind of leaving these, tiny skins of microbial goods behind us. And I think if we kind of bring the body into the equation, I think that the microbe becomes less mysterious and less othered through its ridiculously small scale. and starts to become something that we can actually see in real terms, which is one of the reasons for the bioelectrical interfaces that we're conducting, because so work at the University of West of England through the MFC, the microbial fuel cell, essentially a microbial battery. These microbes generate electrons as waste, and so they do that in real time. So it sets up the possibility of creating interfaces that are working in real time, which is one of the big problems of microbes and bodies in terms of, let's call them the bioart practices, because microbes leave their goods in a different space and scale and time period than humans experience. So kind of going through the biodigital actually gives us a language through which we can start to invent a discourse between the body and the presence of microbes and, you know, how they work together. So conjuring forth various hotspots of visibility, being aware of our body as a kind of an extended instrument in space, thinking of the intersections, interfaces, fields, affordances, the narratives that we are generating through simply being a body in space. Being a body in space transforms a space. Once you have a body, you have a metabolism and a space is changing around you. It's a very different way of thinking about space than, let's say, in a modern way where the body has a very discrete envelope or surface which ends at the skin, and it's much leakier and transformational. So I think there's a whole kind of set of imaginative tools, but I think if we think through the body, I think we can, you know, really start to participate and start conjure forth microbial experiences. I can't hear you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think I'm imagining, as you call it, a kind of living machine rather than a kind of a static kind of built environment. And it's interesting that you describe space as being kind of generated by us, and then the kind of systems around us, things we touch and come into contact with. So it feels like a very sort of human scale intervention. And something that can kind of build outwards rather than a sort of utopia that we might impose on a kind of an urban fabric, for instance. So yeah, you've really sort of fired our imaginations on that, I think, and just to think about it in a different way.
Drawing instruments in that context as well. So if we are constantly drawing ourselves into environments, you know, maybe that starts to give us a choreography of possibility. But
sorry guys, I've got to remember to kind of switch on and off my mic. Apologies everyone. I just wanted to ask a second question about perhaps just how you work and the sort of space, how you see the space of work. I understand it's quite a collaborative enterprise, so I can imagine that that's also part of it. But whether you actually sort of work in a kind of laboratory way or a theoretical way that's then applied to this at a different scale through collaborations effectively. So could you just explain a little bit about how you work? That would be really helpful.
Yes, absolutely. I think, you know, through the experimental architecture group, we have different skill sets in proximity with each other. And I think that our collective work really informs each other. So in other words, our kind of workshops and laboratories are many different kinds of spaces. Sometimes they are performance spaces. So, you know, one of the kinds of practice that we have been working with is circus. You know, again, not looking at the, let's call it the traditional notion of a body, but a body in its extreme, a body at its most kind of plastic in terms of its relationships with space. Other practices are really about making objects, so living bricks, and that's a very workshop-based practice. But then we might take that brick and take it into an unusual context where we might interrogate it maybe on a building site or you know, in the landscape. So essentially one having an open idea about where one makes work, and 2, about taking that work for a walk into different environments, engaging lots of different perspectives and skill sets. And I would say the students that we work with are absolutely part of this. This isn't just about some kind of kind of network of experts in the sky. This is absolutely realised through studios and questions, and really stretching some of the juxtapositions and passions that all get enfolded into the mix. So it's a very open practice, and yes, a production space, a space of living itself.
Yes, thanks for telling us a little bit more about that. That's really insightful. I think just due to the nature of the work, it feels like it's not a kind of fixed entity. It's got to be kind of flexible, move around and work in different environments. I've just got one short question to finish off with before we move to the next part of the symposium, and that's a question from the audience, just asking, do you see this as something that could be implemented in individual homes, so that it kind of works kind of outwards from our home environment effectively? You said a little bit briefly in your lecture, so perhaps you could just expand upon that.
Yes, I think that the microbial actually gives us a new economy of the household, a new economy. And again, it's because something that we traditionally can manage, the circularity of resources in our living spaces. And so bringing that into the juxtaposition of a commons, I think we actually have the building blocks of a workable and livable set of economies that go work differently than private and public, which is our usual discourse about economy. So it is really about exactly the things that were said in the first presentation. How do we reinvent an economy? Where is value and how is it exchanged? And microbes really are our marketplace.
Great, thanks very much, Rachel. I think we'll return to some of these issues. You've clearly identified threads between the talks already, so we'd like to kind of return to some of these at the end, perhaps. But so thank you very much. What I'll do now is I'll switch over just to introduce the next guest.
Nick, you're on mute.
Oh dear, there's the mute button again. Yes, apologies everyone. I'd like to introduce the next speaker. It's Dr. Helena Steiner from OpenCell. So OpenCell was founded in 2018 and it offers laboratories for biotech startup companies, many of which are graduates straight from university and other kind of innovators in the field. I think it's also worth mentioning, I know Helena will speak about this in much more detail, they've been at the forefront of pandemic research, so they were the first company to offer mobile testing for COVID-19 and remain a key component of that. So I'd like to hand over now to Helena. Hope she's all ready to go there, and leave you to tell you about her work. Thank you.
So let's see if that works. Can you see my screen and hear me? Yeah?
Yep, that's good. Thank you, Helena.
Finally, sorry, it took a little bit longer. So yeah, I'm super excited to be here. I'm Helena Steiner. I'm the CEO of OpenCell, and we are a biotech company focused on making labs. And I actually thought that I'd start by introducing myself a little bit, by sharing my journey, how I ended up where I am right now. Because like many of you, I have a design background. And I still can remember my first day at uni. I was super excited to finally study product design at the Bauhaus University. And at that stage, I was already picturing myself designing chairs, tables, shelves, somewhere in a studio in Berlin. But the first words of my professor completely threw me off guard. He asked all of us, who thinks in the room will be a product designer after this course? And everybody obviously was kind of like raising their hands, right? Because that was the reason why we all were there. And his response was like, not even half of you will be. And he was saying not because you're not skilled, or it's because this next few years will introduce you to so many different fields and people, and will show you many new pathways. And actually, there, I think it's 65% of the jobs students will have, they don't even exist yet. And for you who are still kind of like studying this virtual room, it's actually your chance really to define those, what I find extremely exciting. So I took my chance, and so after I studied at the Bauhaus, I made my way to London and made a MSc at Imperial College and another MA at the Royal College of Art in Innovation Design Engineering, because I wanted to learn how I can actually integrate new technologies and electronics in my work, because I felt like that really kind of was stopping me to progress. And that actually then provided me with an additional new opportunity to collaborate with the MIT Media Lab and MIT Chemical Engineering, where I learned how to work with living organisms such as bacteria, which we already heard quite a bit about, which then led to a completely new direction at Microsoft Research, where I've worked with the Human Experience and Design Group and the Computational Biology Group, which ultimately really allowed me to integrate computation, but also biology in my work. So as we already heard, actually, we've met from many of the other speakers, what happened for me is as a result, you know, this design, engineering, and science really started to kind of naturally merge in my way of thinking and working. So I thought I'd give you kind of like a quick example of how that could look like if you work that way. So what you just saw is actually, it's a running suit, or we tested it with a ballet, which allows the wearer to kind of control its body temperature in a better way. So it supports the body to either cool down or to keep warm, depending on which situation you are. So to give you a little bit of a scenario, let's say you go for a run and all your muscles are still very cold. You as a whole person are a little bit cold. But as soon as you actually start exercising, your muscles heat up, and therefore your body heats up. And most of our clothing doesn't really allow you to kind of, to help your body to kind of cool down. So in that scenario, actually, all these tiny little flaps start opening up, so your body can cool down. But when you stop running, your muscles actually cool down fairly quickly, and you started already sweating, so you get cold very quickly. So in that moment, all these tiny little flaps actually close again to help you to kind of like not get cold. And what is quite exciting, that actually all of that is done with the help of bacteria. So in the form of a coating that can expand and contract. And what is really interesting in this project is that it needed really a diverse set of people and disciplines to make it happen. So you needed the biology to kind of understand the bacteria and to study their behavior. But then the next step was also, let's switch to quickly. We also then, biology is very complex, but our body is also very complex. So if you look at the heat and the sweat map of a body, you needed the architectural computation to really engineer the garment that allows you to react at the right areas. Because some body parts heat up, some body parts actually sweat more, and we had to engineer it that way. But we also needed the help of electronic engineering and manufacturing to actually be able to produce something on a scale that can be actually worn. Because often, you know, as we heard, you know, to actually bring it from the micro scale to the macro scale is a completely different challenge as well. And And there were actually many other people involved, from fashion design to mechanical engineering, to really kind of like translate everything that we have seen. And what I actually did after this many years, so 3 years ago, I decided to leave research in academia. All those projects were kind of happening more in the academic field, because one thing that I kind of like missed, or one thing that kind of made me quite annoyed, to be completely honest, is we made a lot of exciting stuff that also works. But I wanted to see that it actually really goes into people's hand and that people can use it. So I left academia, and sadly after I left, I realized that there is no place where I actually can continue doing what I've done, because you do need an incredible, diverse equipment and environment to actually be able to do that. So at that stage, I met my co-founder, Tom, who was exactly in the same situation. He was a plant scientist, synthetic biologist, Cambridge University, and he wanted to really see his idea in reality. So that was really the reason why Tom and I built 3 years ago OpenCell, which is a biotech park made of 70 shipping container labs in White City, London. And our goal is to make biotech more accessible, but also more affordable, and ultimately we want to build better labs that are more suitable to the type of work that we kind of like see kind of appearing more and more. And I think what is kind of important also there is to kind of build a critical mass for biotechnology, to allow people to test and prototype ideas and to ultimately make them a reality. So we have a very, very diverse set of residents that are working with us, that kind of range from personal therapeutics, actually using flies, to new foods, to sustainable materials. And actually one of our first tenants was Biome, which we are really, really proud of. But then other residents also include, for example, company like Motus Media, where they are looking into how they can actually build 100% vegan meat. Or people like Better Dairy, where they are looking into how they can build vegan milk proteins in the laboratory to kind of like minimize really the agriculture that we have to use at the moment when it comes to the milk production. So as a company, what for us we are doing is actually we are focusing on the infrastructure that allows those companies to actually do these projects. So that includes the lab itself, it includes the equipment, but it also includes often the software that is needed. Biology can be really complex, and you have to deal with a lot of data. So that kind of like brings me a little bit to what already got mentioned when I came back from Christmas holiday in mid-January this year. I guess we all followed the news from China that there is a virus outbreak and that there's a chance that it can swap over to Europe. And we decided then as a company that we wanted to snap in action and decided that we can actually help with the infrastructure knowledge that we have. So what we did is we built an all-in-one diagnostic laboratory that simply fits in a box. So to do this, we really had to look from the micro to how we actually can extract the viral RNA to the absolutely macro in how can we actually ship an entire laboratory around the globe. And whilst most countries decided on like a more like central testing strategy, including the UK, which is very useful also, but you know what it creates if you really look in these kind of like mega testing facilities, you put a lot of pressure into one location. So if one thing goes wrong, the whole system breaks down. So we decided to build mobile laboratories, which can be shipped anywhere, what really allows you for much greater flexibility in a response. Because if you're looking more into a decentralized model, it ultimately allows you for a larger coverage, but it also makes it more safer. Even if one breaks down, you still have a lot of variety where you can switch over. And the other benefit that it brings you, you can actually bring it in any location of need. So if you just think about like scenarios like a local outbreak or a care home, you can really bring it to the people rather than having to ship patient samples around an entire country. And if you think about it, it's actually also not much different into how our healthcare system works in general. It is kind of like a cottage industry. So even like the smallest village has a GP, right? Because everyone can get sick at some point. So we really piggyback in some way already how the healthcare system is set up. But to make this work, we had to look at the challenge at its entirety and make an all-in-one solution. If you would have just focused on one part, it would have been very hard to kind of produce something very rapid. Because surprisingly, the biggest challenge really of COVID testing wasn't really a scientific one. So if we are doing PCR testing, or the majority of the COVID testing are PCR tests, this is something that is really common, not only in the diagnostics field, but in general in molecular biology. It was already the gold standard. What it really was, it was an infrastructure and a logistical challenge. And the reason for that is there are like so many different components that are needed just for a single test. You need, I think, over 50 different plastic components. You need really a large amount of equipment. You need a diversity of reagents. And you also need to be able to track not only the patient samples, but you have to track that each single component and each staff has done everything exactly the same way to make sure that the quality is there. Because just like one wrong test can have a massive impact on somebody's health. So how we really looked at it a little bit was more almost like a McDonald's for diagnostics. And I'm not sure if anybody of you like watched the film The Founder, but it's basically about like how McDonald's was built. But in the film they show how they optimized the making of a burger, but optimizing ultimately the architecture of the kitchen to kind of really look into the protocol and how can we arrange it that it's easier for multiple people to produce a burger in a short amount of time while having consistency. So it's not far off actually to a diagnostic test, as strange as it sounds. Another big inspiration in general for us is when we look at labs is the Frankfurter Kitchen and Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky, because she looked at the kitchen in a time where money and space was limited. And I think we also have to look into healthcare in a way of like, how can we not only make it better, but how can we also make it more affordable, and how can we democratize it in a way. And what she did, she was really looking into how many kilometers do we actually run around the kitchen to get our household stuff done. And it was actually a very large amount. And she looked into how can she actually minimize the space of the kitchen while minimizing also the effort that goes into your tasks, but minimizing the money that you spend on it. And labs are not quite different to a kitchen. They're very similar in a way. You do follow a recipe. And in our lab, particular diagnostic one, and that we have built, we follow one single recipe over and over again. So for us, it was like, how can we optimize the lab to make it perfect for the one recipe? I have to say sorry, my IT side is an absolute mess, so my presentation gets stuck, so I'm sorry that I'm sometimes flying through. But yeah, if you look into the lab, in the interior of each one, what we've done, every single one is exactly identical. And everything that is placed inside the container is designed to optimize the process. But the additional challenge that we also had was like, how do you ship something so big around the globe, which is ready to go as quickly as possible? And for us, that's where really the shipping container came in very handy, because we could focus on the interior on a very small space to optimize it, but then also really almost close the outside doors. And there is already a very functional global infrastructure and logistics setup where we can easily ship them around the world. So what we have actually done, we have used tunnel shipping containers, high cube tunnel shipping containers, what means you can actually open them from both sides, because how diagnostic testing works is actually you need to have a linear workflow. You're never allowed to go in the wrong direction. You always walk in one direction, go outside the one side, and then you come back into the front again. And the reason for that is actually cross-contamination. RNA can be so tiny and it can get stuck on your lab coat, and if you walk between the rooms backwards and forwards, what can happen is when there are a lot of positives, you can actually cross-contaminate your samples. So the shipping container, tunnel shipping container, actually gave us the perfect canvas to build such a laboratory. But the beauty is, because it is really kind of a ISO and standardized shipping box ultimately, it already comes with a CSC plate, meaning it is already validated not only for sea freight, but also for just like shipping around on the roads. But then, yeah, if you look inside, it is also that you have every single component exactly in the location where you need it, and you have your different components. And one part what is really important when you look in those laboratories is actually also the airflow. So a little bit coming back to the cross-contamination, each single room has to kind of be really designed that each airflow, also considering people walking in and out, is controlled, that no room can exchange any particles. That was actually the biggest challenge for us to kind of build it in such a short amount of time, because you need negative air pressure and positive air pressure in different rooms. But ultimately, the shipping container actually, because it is very airtight, allowed us to actually move much quicker. And one key component for us as well was for the testing. What was important is, it is, if you look at hospitals, how they in general set up in laboratories, they have really mastered how diagnostic works. But I guess in normal times, how you look at healthcare, you really focus on one patient. You test one patient and you give them the results. But if you look at a pandemic, we are dealing with masses that have to be tested. So there has to be a little bit of a different approach. So rather than actually having it patient-centered, it is really about almost kind of the automation of the tests to get as many tests through a day. And one single shipping container in our case allows you to test 2,000 patients every single day in 24 hours. And how we were actually able to do that is by automating the majority of the tests. So we are using liquid handling robots that allow us, rather than kind of having to pipette thousands of samples by hand, it basically does exactly the same movement, but in an automated way. So you can program it easily to say how to move liquids around, and rather than just having a single pipette, each single head has actually 96 pipettes. So you almost have 96 people working at the same time, what allows us really to kind of like process 96 samples every single time when you put it through a robot. But to be able also to kind of track this large amount of samples, what we had to do was to write our own software. So what we had to look into was also not a little bit coming back to food again. I guess we get a lot of inspiration from food. If you look a little bit at how you order your takeaway, your Deliveroo, you order your test, you can follow the process of your food getting prepared, and then you have your result, or your kind of like food at the door. And there can be a lot of different orders for a Deliveroo person at the same time. So we looked at it a little bit in a similar way. So when samples come in, we have a software that actually can track them through the entire process. So at the moment when you get swabbed, the unique barcode gets created and gets sent into the laboratory that they can prepare to know how many samples are coming in that day. And when those samples then arrive in the laboratory, we rescan them again, and they get allocated to a very specific valve in our 96 valve plate. Which then allows us through the entire process of the diagnostics, so you go for actually multiple stations, to know exactly where the one particular patient sample is, and if there have been any challenges throughout the process. And in the end of the process, when you actually analyze the data, you can match the CT value, which I will explain in a moment a little bit better, to the particular patient sample. And then we send the results out, and if you're negative, actually the patient will get directly a text message that he can move freely around again, or in the scenario that you're actually positive, it is directly connected with the track and trace team, what allows us to hunt down the people as quickly as possible to avoid that anything gets through the spread. So to kind of like walk you a little bit through how that actually looks in reality, that is from inside the laboratory where the sample gets scanned, and in station A is actually, so we split it in 3 different stations. Station A is where the patient sample comes in. And this is the only process where there is still a lot of manual handling to do because it was not really improving the time. So each single sample gets scanned in, and you do have to unpack it, what was hard to kind of fully automate at that stage. And then a person is actually pipetting that patient sample into a 96 deep well plate. So that is the one that you actually see inside the biosafety cabinet. And the biosafety cabinet is actually what protects our stuff from the virus itself. So what is happening inside there is actually active virus samples in there. So it's a key component to be really safe on that. And then from that station, we actually move forward to our automated system. So from that stage on, we move to our station B, what is our RNA extraction system, where we actually use a robot to kind of use something really cool, what are magnetic beads. So what these magnetic beads do actually, they attach to the RNA. So what you actually do in a PCR is you go from the human sample and then you try to pop open the human cells so that you have all the little components like floating around freely. And let's say you are infected with the virus. The virus injects actually viral RNA into your cells. So what we want is we actually wash out just the viral RNA to see if it is present. So those little magnetic particles that you see there, they attach to that particular RNA. And then what the robot actually does in the majority of its process, washes everything out that is not attached to the magnetic beads. If you want to learn more about it, BombBio is a really good reference, what is also an open source version of it, where you can actually work with it if you're interested in it. And then from there, you actually move into a separate room, what we call Station C1. And what is happening there, we actually start preparing for the PCR process. So now we have our samples where the RNA got extracted. And what we want to look now is RNA is basically the single-stranded part of the DNA. And what we want to do is called polymerase chain reaction. So we want to now assemble it to a full DNA strand, and then once that it multiplies itself as often as possible, so that we are then actually able to have enough of the RNA to see if it is present or not. If you don't have any RNA, we won't see it, but if you had a little bit, then we will see, we have the chance to actually detect it. If you have a large amount, then it's a little bit simpler. So what we are doing there, it's called master mixes. It's basically magical glue that helps you to kind of like do that. And we always add also in each single process a control. So it very easily can happen that something goes wrong, and those internal controls in each sample can actually detect if any of the staff members or in any of the robots did anything wrong and can point that out at any stage. And from there on, you walk into the last room where you have now your PCR plate, and you pop it into a machine that is called a qPCR machine. What is analyzing and multiplying now those DNA strands. And what you're actually looking into, what is the most interesting part, is the middle part, what is called the CT value. So what you actually want to look into, how quickly does the curve go up and multiply the DNA? And based on that, you can detect if there is a positive and if the RNA is present, or if it's a negative and there's no or almost no RNA present. So one way also, because it is a fairly kind of like thorough process, but we are very keen as well to kind of share. We are very keen on the open source side at OpenCell, what I think the name is already saying. So what we also have is a YouTube channel where you can not only find out what all our different companies are doing, but they're also like educational videos. If you, let's say, want to understand how does PCR work, how can I get involved with that? We do have a lot of kind of videos where it really walks you through in a very accessible way, but very detailed way to either get involved yourself or in general, for us, it's really important to make biotech more accessible for the general public. Healthcare should be really understandable by everyone, in our opinion. Another part of what I think is quite unique with the project, what we have done is we made it fully open source. So we published quite early on in May and our entire protocol, what covers not only the blueprints for the container so that you can produce it yourself, but it also covers the blueprints for the reagents, the blueprints for the programming side, how you can build the software and how you can build the robotics. So for us, it's really important to not kind of be secretive on it. In our opinion, open source really is the essence of reproducibility, and in the end allows just more people to improve and expand the possibilities what a project can have. So we had in total actually 200 volunteers also working with us on the project from around the world, because it was quite unbelievable about the diversity of people that was needed for that. So I think the more obvious ones are kind of like the automation when it comes to robotics, or the architecture and the microbiology. But there were also additional new challenges that we were just absolutely not aware of. So on the paper that you just see, there's Mark Zuckerman, who is leading the virology department at King's College Hospital. Working with patients and working with diagnostics is a completely new world for us. How you can actually swap and working with nurses together. That was a completely new world for us. But also, I guess the regulation when it comes to healthcare was something we haven't done before. So our laboratory, we are at the moment in the process of getting it UCAS accredited, what means that you really have to go through the whole process to be accredited as an official medical laboratory. But so far actually has never happened for a mobile container lab. And that was really just possible because we had so many people joining us and helping us throughout the entire process. So yeah, you can find the paper in the link that you can just see there. And as I mentioned, when it comes to the open source, you can either find it in our YouTube channel, but you can also find the paper, but we do have a GitHub. So not only the diagnostic laboratory, but every single project that we are doing at OpenCell, we try to publish as much as possible on the GitHub so that either people can contribute to the project or, as I said, kind of reproduce it and make own advantage for themselves. And I think for us, the reasons for the open source and what we would really love to see is, and we gave a few examples in our paper, is like, how would people actually use the project? So we gave a few examples on how we saw these mobile laboratories actually in action. And one way, there was a lot of conversation when it comes to universities, and I guess like many of you can relate, how can you reopen the universities again? So we were in a lot of conversations with London universities on actually how can we test all the different campuses to allow the laboratories to reopen and the campuses to reopen. So looking into if one container laboratory in a completely mobile version could actually help an entire university to reopen. If you kind of look into that, a university is around 20,000 people, you could be able to test actually the majority every week to kind of allow people to come safe back to it. But we also looked into the diversity of the containers, and it is a little bit like Legos in a way. So there is also a great opportunity to build larger facilities out of it. If you have a really large city like London, there is really also the benefit sometimes to actually have, pop-up mega facilities, as we have seen in Milton Keynes, to really allow us to go for tens of thousands tests every day. And let's say if there's like a large local outbreak or a shutdown like we're currently in. But the one that we kind of really focused on as OpenCell was on like how we can augment existing healthcare infrastructure. So how can you help an existing hospital, for example, to expand its capacity or its knowledge? So we do have our shipping container labs in a couple locations, but most important for us case study is actually in Jersey. So Jersey is an island from the Channel Islands. Population is around like 100,000 people, and they do have a hospital, but they do not have PCR facilities or the on-island knowledge and staff to actually do the testing. So what they had to do for the majority in the beginning when the pandemic broke out, they had to swap all the people, send it to the UK, and then wait until the results came back. So they were really depending on other people. So we started kind of conversations with them in early May and June, and decided on that we actually build a national testing strategy together. So we brought over one of our mobile laboratories and set it up in just like 3 weeks and started to test every single passenger that is either flying in or coming in by boat. What allowed us that is that you really had control on if any infected person is coming in. And by also combining it with community testing, it really kind of allowed you to get hold of the virus. So Jersey, Channel Islands has now actually one of the lowest infection rates in Europe. And what it allowed them to do is that actually the country didn't have to shut down. So throughout the majority of the time, stores were allowed to be open, restaurants were able to kind of like be as usual, but also tourism was still kind of like happening. So the economy didn't have to completely shut down and ultimately allowed us to really kind of like protect the people. But it's really, really a rewarding example when you see a product that you have built kind of put in action. And it is ultimately rewarding, I have to say. I've seen so many samples on when you see a positive kind of like popping up, what is not really nice to see, but at the same time, knowing that you were able to catch them in under 8 hours to kind of isolate them to ultimately protect other people is really, really rewarding work. So yeah, it is literally placed at the airport to allow really kind of to bring the samples in as quickly as possible. And what I really have to highlight, what is unique with that project is rather than kind of like be independent, again, what I said in the beginning, looking at the entirety of its problem, we work really closely with the government on this. So from from a user experience almost, it's a very beautiful thing. You arrive on the island, it takes shorter than showing your passport that you get swapped. And then you as a person actually don't have to do anything, or your life is not really kind of changed until you kind of like get your results. So you go in your hotel, even the hotel is informed. So until you have your negative result, the only thing that you can't get is service in your room, or your room doesn't get cleaned. And as soon as the negative results arrive, you get a text message, the hotel gets informed, and everything kind of switches back to normal. And I found it a very impressive kind of effort from the government as well to look at that and to also at the same time work in parallel with us, a track and trace system, what really allows you to kind of like function as an entity. So yeah, I sneak a little bit of kind of advertisement into the end. We are really growing at the moment quickly. So we have now built quite a variety of those kind of diagnostics laboratory. They are in Pakistan, they're in Jersey, there is one in the UK, and there soon will be another one in a quite unique location. And what we are really looking for is a very diverse team. But we're also looking into building also our laboratories for kind of like more the startup world. So architecture, as I mentioned, is really kind of like a key part of what we are doing. And we're really looking into people who were interested in kind of going into the biotechnology world by contributing with their unique skills. And as I mentioned, it is a very, very rewarding work because you see really how you can help, how you can have an impact, to be honest, and how you can help other people. So if you just go to opencell.bio/jobs, you will see a quite big variety. But as I also said in the beginning, the best jobs are not written yet. So we are always looking for people who have their own ideas and opinions on how they can actually contribute. So if there's anything, if you can't find the job that you think is suitable, we always love to hear from you. So yeah, what I would say is check out our YouTube channel. You see all the different companies that we are working with. We also will always walk through the processes on how were you actually able to do that project, how does diagnostic work, how does lab-grown meat work. And if you want to reproduce this, check out our GitHub channel. And if you're interested to join us in any of our projects, just email me. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Eleni. Thanks very much, Helene. If you don't mind, we've run into your question time a little bit here. So what I'd like to do is just fold some of the questions to the QA at the end. But there is one interesting point I'd just like to pick up at this point. I'll just perhaps move into the window before I introduce the next speaker. But I just wanted to ask a little bit about the kind of responsiveness, and it feels like something that you established at OpenCell. It's 2018, I think, but it feels like the tools you're using are kind of allow you to take this kind of quite direct action and quite quickly. I would call it a kind of responsiveness. I think in relation to a kind of resilience to some of the things that are happening around us, it's quite important that we're able to kind of move fast on some of these things. So I just wanted to ask one question, just to give the audience an idea just about the kind of timescale, because clearly you've got some of these projects off the ground really quickly. So could you just say a little bit about that, please?
So the lab, we started in February, to be honest, with a hackathon. I think February they kind of published the whole genome of the virus, and we just kind of wanted to look into how that is relevant. In March we started with the idea on like why not making a shipping container diagnostic lab, and in June we shipped and deployed the entire laboratory. But also, I think there are a lot of steps that I didn't talk about where, that includes validation. So, you have to get validated per Public Health England, etc. So it was an incredible quick process for such a large project, where I'm, to be honest, still quite amazed by. Yeah,
no, it's really impressive, the turnaround. I mean, I'm just working in similar fields and just waiting for things to slowly kind of grind through this process. So yes, it's very impressive actually. Yeah, if you don't mind, I'm going to introduce the next speaker. And I'd like to come back to a couple of other issues that you raised as well, but I think because they're sort of following through from other speakers, we can pick those up in the final QA. So thanks again. We're now going to move to the final keynote speaker, Michael Paulin. So Michael's an architect. He established exploration architecture in 2007, and exploration architecture has since gone on to become a leading think tank in regenerative design and circular economy. I'll keep my intro brief, Michael, apologies, but I'd really like to hand over to you to explain a little more about your work. So we're about to send you live now. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you very much for involving me, and it's great to be involved in such an important subject. And I think everyone is talking about how COVID is likely to be an inflection point. And what I'm going to argue is that human survival depends on us seizing this moment for some really radical rethinking. And I hope that COVID will mark the end of what I'd call human exceptionalism. The idea that somehow we are removed from the laws of physics and we can exist separately from the realm of biology. And I want to just say a few words about this image. Now, most of you are probably familiar with the Earthrise image. So that was the photo taken of planet Earth from the moon. And some people say that that was what kick-started the environmental movement. I find this image much more interesting in many ways. So this was taken by the Cassini spacecraft. As it was passing Jupiter, it turned back and took this picture of planet Earth. And that's the small blue dot there. And for me, this conjures up just how sort of isolated we are in space, and how basically no one is coming to our rescue. It is up to us. And it also makes me think about deep time. And just for the sake of argument, if you were to imagine the history of planet Earth as if it were a calendar year, and you were looking back from midnight on New Year's Eve, then what you'd find is that the first life forms appeared in March. The dinosaurs appeared in early December and they disappeared on Christmas Day. Humans appeared at lunchtime today. The whole of recorded history, the whole of recorded history flashed past in the last 45 seconds. And in the last 1 second, humans became a geophysical force, altering the whole atmosphere. In the last third of a second, that's the time I've been alive, we extinguished 2/3 of non-human animal life on the planet. And to continue this analogy, what we do in the next 1/10 of a second will determine whether we collapse or survive. And in Roman Krasnarik's fantastic book, The Good Ancestor, he has this quite arresting diagram which shows 3 possible pathways for civilization. The breakdown one is pretty clear, that makes sense. The scary one in many ways is the reform pathway, because in that scenario, governments would do just about enough to get themselves re-elected. They'd invest just enough money in green technology, but probably post-pandemic, everything will return to normal because that's what the vested interests want. And it'll be pretty much normal economics. And all that will do is delay the time when we actually collapse. And I want to spend most of my talk this evening talking about the transformation pathway. But before I get onto that, I just want to rewind a bit and talk about some of the projects that I've worked on in the past. And of course, it's important to remember that a lot of architects and designers have been working on sustainable architecture for a long time, decades. And I worked on the Eden project. I was part of the core team that designed that. And it was while I was working on that I really understood the potential of biomimicry and how, by learning from the way that biology has solved problems, we could achieve really radical increases in resource efficiency. So for instance, on the design of that external envelope, we achieved a factor 100 saving, achieving the same result, but with 1/100th of the amount of energy and material input compared to a conventional glass solution. And I got more and more interested in the potential of biomimicry to address key challenges like resource depletion, climate change, biodiversity loss. And so I set up Exploration to focus on exemplar projects. This was one of them, the Sahara Forest Project. This brought together synergistic technologies in a way that would produce energy and food crops while revegetating deserts. And then we worked on another number of other projects that we're trying to push boundaries. So this is the BioRock Pavilion, a whole building that would be grown in seawater. We also developed an office building based on biomimetics. So we refer to nearly 100 different biological organisms here and produced a scheme that I felt very proud of. It was going to be energy surplus, as well as creating a fantastic environment for people. And about 5 years into running Exploration, I realized that not many of these schemes were getting built. And so I engaged in quite a lot of self-criticism. I worked hard at getting better at public speaking. I refined the business models. I met a lot of business leaders giving talks at business events and so on. And I hoped that that would be enough to really make progress. And so we carried on. This was another project that we developed. This is a zero waste textile factory. It's also zero carbon and closed loop on water and zero toxins with a 5-year payback period. We designed this ultra low energy data center. And after another 5 years, I realized that this still wasn't working. And I looked back through the projects for the main reasons that they didn't go ahead. And the message I kept receiving was that the market is not ready for these ideas yet. The ideas are great, but the market's just not ready for them. And then in 2018, when the IPCC issued their latest and most alarming report, showing that we were heading pretty rapidly towards collapse, I thought, well, this is just completely insane. What is going on? How can we be this close to collapse, and yet I'm being told that the market is not ready for these solutions? So I reread one of my favorite essays about how to make change happen. It's by Donella Meadows, and it's called Leverage Points. And in this essay, she argues that because systems are complex, it's not always obvious where you should intervene to bring about the changes you want. And she draws up a list of 12 places to intervene in a system in order of priority. And a lot of the things that I used to think were really quite influential, like exemplar projects, like subsidies and small-scale regulations and so on, they're way down the list. Right at the top is changing the mindset or paradigm out of which the system behavior emerges. And so that got me thinking about, you know, where are we, and what kind of paradigm shifts do we need to change? And cultural commentators often like to point to very specific moments in time when things happen. So some people argue that the Anthropocene started on the 16th of July in 1945. That was when this detonation occurred, which will be detectable for the rest of the history of planet Earth, the traces of radiation from that atom bomb test in the deserts in New Mexico. Some commentators, mainly Charles Jenks, argued that this day, 16th of March 1972, this was the day that modernism died, when the Pruitt-Igoe housing block was detonated. And I believe that sustainability, or at least conventional sustainability, died on the 10th of October 2018, when the Bloomberg building by Foster's was awarded the Sterling Prize. And that was only 2 days after the IPC had issued their report. So why do I think this? Well, it's because by the architect's own admission, this building, the energy savings and the environmental profile and so on, this was consistent with a 3 degrees C temperature rise. And 3 degrees would be enough to be catastrophic. That would easily be enough to tip us over into resource wars and the breakdown of societies. So how can it be that a building that arguably was the most sustainable office building ever, it certainly achieved the highest BREEAM rating ever, with a philanthropic client and a massive budget, was still nowhere near where we needed to be? So that was partly what encouraged me to join together with various people to launch Architecture Declares a Climate and Biodiversity Emergency. So I met up with an old friend of mine, Steve Tompkins, for a gloomy pint of beer in the pub, talking about what do we do about the IPCC report. And over the course of the evening, we hatched a plan to launch Architects Declare a Climate and Biodiversity Emergency. And then another thing I started around this time was a new book. It's a co-authored book working with the urbanist Sarah Ichioka, provisionally called Flourish, Design Paradigms for Our Planetary Emergency. And both this book and Architects Declare a Climate Emergency, we're looking very much at the kind of paradigm shifts that we need. So I'm going to talk mainly about the shift from sustainable to regenerative design. And this diagram from architect Bill Reed is actually pretty useful for describing the key difference between the two. By the way, can you hear me okay? I'm getting 1 or 2 messages on my computer saying that the network quality is poor. Are you hearing me okay?
All good for me, Michael. Yeah, great.
Okay, all right, very good. Okay, so this describes different levels of environmental performance. The very lowest level is conventional practice, which is being characterized as one step better than breaking the law. Above that is the world of relative improvement, of green design. That's the world of LEED and BREEAM and so on. And then above that is fully sustainable, or as Bill McDonough puts it, 100% less bad. And you see, that's the problem with the way that conventional sustainability is framed. And because pretty much everything we do is less than 100% sustainable, it means that this is all part of a degenerative cycle. So this was quite painful for me to realize, you know, having worked in sustainable design for nearly 30 years, I thought we were making things better. And actually, all we were doing was making things slightly less bad. And so really what we need to do is to get above this line of neutrality into the realm of regenerative design. And just as we used to debate like 25 years ago, what's the ultimate in sustainability? I think now there's a very interesting debate to be had about what is the ultimate in regenerative design. And I concur with people like Bill Reed and others who think that the ultimate is actually to get to a state of co-evolution with nature. And I'm going to talk about some things that I think are crucial for regenerative design under 4 headings: regenerative landscapes, cities, buildings, and materials. So starting with regenerative landscapes, the Sahara Forest Project that I mentioned, this was a scheme that tried to address multiple challenges simultaneously. And it was quite a surprise to learn that a lot of the world's deserts were actually vegetated a fairly short time ago. And we thought that perhaps if we could intervene at some of the boundaries of these deserts, we could push back the sort of line of desertification, re-vegetate those deserts, while actually generating colossal amounts of energy. So, you know, the world's deserts, the amount of energy they receive every year from the sun, if we could capture a small portion of that, it would go a long way towards addressing our energy needs. And the 3 core technologies here were concentrated solar power, a type of greenhouse that is cooled and humidified with seawater and produces fresh water, and then desert revegetation technologies. Now, these are all interesting synergies, so they're actually more productive when you bring them together than they are by themselves. And one of the most interesting synergies is that the shade created by those mirrors makes it possible to grow a whole range of crops underneath that would not normally grow in desert locations. And this is one that we did actually build. We built a test version in Qatar, and that allowed us to experiment with all the main elements of the system. So you can see 2 types of solar power there, the seawater-cooled greenhouses in the middle, desert revegetation experiments. And this was opened during the climate change talks in Doha in 2012. And this allowed us to test all the different technical aspects, refining it, twiddling the knobs, and so on. And alongside that technological work, we also monitored what this was doing to the biodiversity, because we had a hunch that this was going to be delivering some kind of regenerative effect. And we knew at the start that it was literally just a bare patch of desert. There was nothing there. So we made a note of the birds, mammals and insects that appeared on the site during the first 8 months that we were working there. And this infographic shows what we achieved. So the first things to appear were flies, nothing particularly interesting there. Then literally the same day that we had the first plants brought to site, we had birds appearing, and then very soon after that we had grasshoppers and then crickets. A month later we had butterflies appearing, and then other types of birds, wagtails, more insects. Then we had the first problematic species, rats, and their numbers were expanding rather rapidly, but still we were getting more birds and insects. Then we had mice to deal with as well, which is a bit of a pain. Then 3 days after the algae ponds were filled, we had the first dragonflies. And bear in mind, this was a long way from the nearest dragonfly habitat, a long way from the nearest butterfly habitat as well. So it's quite miraculous how nature seems to have the capacity to repair itself if you can just create the right conditions. And then we had an appearance from a feral cat, which is quite handy because the number of rats and mice started going down. Still more insects and more birds. We had an appearance from a rare bird called a hoopoe. Then rufous-tailed shrikes, more insects, other types of wagtail. And eventually we had the first indigenous mammal. It's called a jerboa. It's like a little hopping kangaroo that leaves very distinctive tracks. So all that was achieved in just 8 months on a site 100 meters by 100 meters. And I'm absolutely convinced that if we were to do this over a longer timescale, that regenerative effect would be even more pronounced. Moving on to regenerative cities now, the most persuasive model I've heard for this comes from consultants in the US called Biomimicry 3.8. And what they argue is that rating systems like BREEAM and LEED, they don't go anywhere near far enough. They're very anthropocentric, they're very mechanistic, and they're just nowhere near as thorough and holistic as we need. And what we should do when we're designing a new city or a new piece of city is we should start by identifying how a pristine ecosystem in that part of the world would function. How much oxygen would it produce? How much water would it filter? How much carbon would it sequester? How much wildlife would it accommodate? How much food would it produce? And those should become the targets for our new piece of city. We're nowhere near that at the moment, but when we get to that point, then we could safely say that we had properly integrated that city into a wider long-term stable system. We do have some indications of what this would look like, so I'm convinced that we would see more buildings that have vegetation on them. We would need to do this in a way that's low carbon, so it's not really going to help if this involves using lots of concrete. But these kind of vegetative facades create a lot of habitats, they create evaporative cooling, and a lot of psychological benefits in terms of well-being. One of the biggest changes we would see in a regenerative city is the spaces between buildings. So this was a scheme in South Korea. This used to be covered with an elevated motorway, and the mayor of Seoul persuaded people to tear this down and reinstate the river and a linear park. And that's now become a really popular part of the city, and the temperatures are about 5 degrees C cooler than the rest of the city. Another crucial aspect to regenerative cities is getting them to function like ecosystems. So in an ecosystem, you have a lot of interconnected organisms, they're interdependent, they run entirely on current solar energy, and there's no such thing as waste. The waste from one becomes the nutrient for something else in that system. And this has been tried out. This is an extension to Stockholm. It's called Hammarby Sjöstad, which is designed specifically on ecosystem principles. We also explored this on the Sahara Forest Project. So this diagram shows the green icons of the different technologies, all of which are synergistic. And in simple terms, we're using what we have a lot of, sunlight, seawater, and carbon dioxide, to produce more of what we need. And then I don't have time to go through all those interconnections, but we were getting very close to a zero waste system. And sometimes when I show this to people, they say, well, that looks hellishly complicated. How do you design something like that? I would argue that that is a kind of complexity that we have to be able to deal with. And it's actually nowhere near as complex as a real ecosystem. So in exploration, we developed a little design tool to make it easier to design these. And this allows you to input technologies with their resource flows and then to connect them up. And this shows you anything that is underutilized. And that's a sign that you can add something more to the system to create more value. And then this allows you to press play and you can see how it functions. You could test it by cutting one of those links. And if the whole system breaks down, then that's an indication that you need to add more redundancy or duplication or buffering to make it more resilient. And it should be possible with computational tools like this to process that kind of complexity. So now regenerative buildings. This one I showed you earlier, the biomimetic office. We actually used biomimicry to rethink every aspect of this, trying to achieve radical increase in resource efficiency, trying to make it entirely naturally lit. And we looked at examples like bird skulls that helped us reduce the amount of material we would need very substantially. We learned from curved shells and leaf forms to design a new glazing system that would achieve a 50% saving in glass and a 75% saving in aluminium. We learned from folding beetle wings to design a new sun shading system that would let in exactly the right amount of light and convert all surplus light into electricity. And overall, it would be an energy positive building, as well as being a really uplifting and kind of well-being enhancing place for people to work. The Zero Waste Textiles Factory, this also explored ideas of regenerative design. So we conceived of this very much along the lines of ecosystem models. And I'm going to have to skip through this fairly quickly, but comparing the characteristics of human-made systems and biological systems is pretty telling, actually. And I think if you look down that right-hand list, that's a very good summary of what we need to do with our cities and industries. We conceived of this scheme as having three main realms: the water cycle, the energy cycle, and the factory itself. In the factory, you have various different processes, and there are some interesting synergies between those that we identified. We redesigned the energy system to use biomass CHP, which was much better in all sorts of ways. We could recover waste heat, we could provide heat and electricity. And then by designing out any toxins from the dyeing process, we were able to shift all the water treatment to biological forms of treatment. And this is how it would look inside. So the working area completely flooded with natural light. And then along the sides, you have these big picture windows looking out over the biological water treatment systems, which actually use plants and microorganisms to treat the water. And this also points to another important part of regenerative design, which is biophilia. So this hospital in Singapore uses biophilia to improve people's recovery rates. And there was an academic study of a hospital in Philadelphia where half the beds had a view out to a blank brick wall. The other half had a view out over a planted courtyard. The people with the view of nature recovered 8% more quickly and needed half the amount of pain relieving drugs. And that's an indication of just how big the economic and human benefits are for regenerative design. And finally, regenerative materials. So this organism here, this is the coccolithophore, and in James Lovelock's Gaia theory, he postulated that these were part of the planet's carbon dioxide control mechanism. So when there were increases in CO2 in the atmosphere, historically, you would have had massive blooms of these in the ocean, and then they fall to the ocean floor and build up layers of limestone, restoring the balance in the atmosphere. And the conclusion you could draw from that, if you're into biomimicry, is that one of the ways that nature would solve the challenge of climate change is by making more stuff from atmospheric carbon. And concrete is a really difficult material. I think roughly 8% of the global greenhouse gas emissions are from concrete manufacturing. And if you look at the way biology does the equivalent, well, the nearest thing to concrete is coral. It's a large-scale mineral structure, but the difference is huge. Coral grows by taking carbon out of the environment and sequestering that into a solid form. And there are now some interesting materials that are doing similar things. So this is a biomason. It's a block made from sand mixed with a calcifying bacterium. And then we've been exploring ideas of using tiles made from atmospheric carbon and learning from the way that abalone shells have evolved. So abalone, if you look at it under a powerful microscope, it's made up out of these very thin layers of calcium carbonate with a flexible protein between the layers. And that combination gives it amazing resistance to crack propagation. So at a chemical level, it's 95% identical to ordinary blackboard chalk, but because of that microstructure, it achieves 3,000 times the strength. And with this design for a house, the abalone house, we learnt from the abalone in a number of ways, partly from the larger scale form, using curves to lock in a stiff form, and then also the layers of tiles based on the abalone to create a very stiff and very thin shell. So we reckon that we use about half the amount of material of a conventional house. And this is a table we designed for an exhibition at the Architecture Foundation. So here the learning from biology was in two ways. This form was inspired by the growth patterns of bones and trees, and it aspires to a perfect structural form, trying to get the material exactly where it wants to be. And it also uses a biologically derived polymer. So it's a biologically derived material and a biologically inspired structure, striving for incredible efficiency and made out of atmospheric carbon. And just returning very briefly to Construction Declares, we've expanded it now from architecture to construction. It's growing. We've now got 24 countries signed up to this. And we've developed a strategy for change that is based very much on shifting mindsets. And we are convinced that we need to bring about a kind of tipping point, because a lot of the solutions exist, but the economic conditions aren't right yet. And for that, we need three things. We need a critical mass of support. We need to show that we've got the solutions articulated and the skills to deliver. And very importantly, we need public pressure. And that will allow us to develop the evolved mindsets and for the old ones to rapidly become outdated. So will that be enough? Well, I don't think it will, because I still see a lot of this, a lot of complacency at a political level and at a senior level in business. And so I think to shift this, we really will have to get out on the street. We're all going to have to become activists to a greater or lesser extent. Otherwise, I just cannot see us making the transformations in time. So weird time in history, because we have all the solutions we need to make rapid progress, but at the moment it's not happening. We've got to shift the Overton window, the window of what is regarded as politically feasible. And just to finish, I want to say a few words about this amazing organism. It's a glass sponge, and it has this incredibly efficient structure, which engineers have been studying for years. And it's made out of glass fiber with higher optical quality to human-made glass fiber. And bear in mind that that's made at ambient temperature and pressure out of available materials in seawater, probably using about, at a guess, 1/1,000,000th of the amount of energy of conventional glass manufacturing. And then those fibers go down into the seabed to anchor it. And the end of each of those fibers terminates in a cluster of lenses, which gather light from bioluminescent bacteria. And it conducts that light up to put on a sort of lighting display to attract food to the organism. And it embodies many of the things that we need to learn from if we're really to make progress. So it shows incredibly efficient and beautiful structures. It shows ultra low energy materials manufacturing and symbiotic relationships. And I think it points to a new relationship with the rest of the living world. So rather than seeing nature as something to be plundered for resources, it shows nature as a source of wonder and a source of some of the best solutions that will allow us to radically rethink what we're doing and design solutions fit for the next billion years. Thank you very much. And if you're interested in learning more, that's my book, Biomimicry in Architecture.
Thanks very much, Michael. Perhaps if you just stay online for a little while. What I thought I'd do is just, there's a couple of specific questions for you, Michael, have come up, and then I'd like to just open up a couple of themes to the speakers, to the panel, if you like. I just wanted to pick up on a point just raised by one of the audience and just add to that theme a little bit, and it was just to perhaps expand on the idea that we in some way learn from nature, but also that some of your projects actually start to, dare I say, kind of grow architecture or use kind of ecology of growth in terms of materials. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, and whether it's an approach that's seen as kind of permanent, or how the sort of biomaterial element to the structure starts to play a role in the kind of design of the buildings.
Well, funny enough, I think the other speakers would be able to answer that question better than me.
Yes, it's an interesting one because I think it opens up across the board. But I noticed you just begun to kind of sort of tap into that a little bit, and
yeah. Sure. Well, absolutely, it's a fascinating area, and it's one area where there's still a pretty big gulf between the way we tend to make things and the way things work in nature. So, nature grows things and is capable of self-repair, is capable of sensing and responding, It grows things in generally much more sophisticated assemblies that incorporate hierarchies and interface that deliver massive improvements in performance. And we tend to think of humans as incredibly sophisticated and clever, but actually there's so much more that we still need to learn and can learn from learning from biology. And that's why I think it's such an exciting area, because there's a lot of work going on, some brilliant scientists, and often their work stays in rather sort of dusty journals. But by collaborating with designers, there's a real chance to get those ideas and solutions out there to make a real difference to people's lives.
Great, thank you. I'm just having a quick check through the questions. I'll try and fold them into more of a panel discussion now, I think, and just gauging time a little. I think we've touched upon something there as well that's come across all the talks actually, that I'll just open up to the panel a little bit. And that's I've written down the role of non-humans. I didn't kind of expect to write that, but it's been quite an interesting theme actually. And this is there's been a series of questions during the talks, and I could probably just summarize them very briefly to almost material production, waste management, biofuel, bioluminescence you mentioned, and that kind of role of non-humans and the kind of biological in the kind of construction of our spaces. I just wondered if anyone would like to just either perhaps say a little bit more about that, or offer some connections between the talks that have been made today. Rachel.
You need to unmute, Rachel.
Yes, I think, Rachel, I don't seem to have control over that, so perhaps you'd like to unmute.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi. You can hear me now?
Yes, sorry about that.
Great. The thing about biology is that it's living, and there is an ethical dimension when working with living things. So from the cultivation, the kind of, are you going to grow them as battery chickens and kind of abuse them and stress them out? Or are you going to create the kind of organic farming environment? What happens when they start to senesce? What happens when they die? Should there be mourning? I mean, when you've got something that's living and that you actually want to take care and responsibility for its presence in the world, and it becomes a neighbour or a kin, part of your community, then how do you look after it? So that the obligations that we have to the non-human world when we think of ecology are incredibly important. And it's one of those things that Michael was talking about the de-anthropocentrization, about the kind of the recognition of others that aren't ourselves. So how do we start to construct that as a community, as a set of laws, as a set of responsibilities? This is very new for us as we make this transition.
Thanks, Rachel. Would anyone else like to add to that from the panel?
Yes, I think I will. Yeah, I think I completely agree with you, Rachel. We've been living in a very human-centered world where all of our perceptions of everything around us and the systems we've created, the policies that exist, they're all very human-centered, and they all favour human existence over others. I think one sort of question that's always sort of troubling us as we're working with living organisms and bringing that into production on a large scale, and having a huge positive environmental impact, and also embedding social impact and all of that. But there's always that question, we are working with living organisms. We are creating a production facility out of a living organism. And the ethical question always comes in of, is this really an ethical process? Is this really an ethical approach? And whilst it's huge advancement for biomimicry in industry, that question becomes a really big one. But I think one theory or thought that often makes me feel really comfortable and makes me look at it in a very different way, and it's also quite an interesting approach, because it also makes me question whether the question of it being an ethical thing is actually a human-centered question, because did we domesticate mycelium, for example, to create our insulation panels? Or did mycelium domesticate humans so that it can grow and evolve and mutate and become stronger and and much more present in the world and become a much more important species that we continue to maintain it and feed it and grow it? So I think
that also assumes that the non-human doesn't have an ethics as well. So I mean, you know, so for example, mycelium has an ethics with algae or any, you know, root tendrils, that it starts out with some kind of co-inhabitation. And so we could regard that actually as a non-human ethics, which is reminding us to embrace our own. So I think I absolutely agree with you. I think these are really important questions. I don't think there are absolutes on this, and I think it's really impressive that you as a company are actually thinking about these things.
Another dimension to this that I think is fascinating is that the boundaries between what we think of as human and non-human are nowhere near as clear as we used to think they were. So, you know, we used to think that we were humans and everything outside us was sort of other. But actually, with developments in understanding of the human biome, we know that actually our human cells are outnumbered 10 to 1 by microbial cells. And given that we are completely dependent for our oxygen on life support systems elsewhere in nature, where are the boundaries of the human? And that's why ideas such as interbeing that are being promoted by people like Charles Eisenstein and others, which would have been probably dismissed as hippie nonsense only 10 years ago, are now starting to develop a much more coherent and accepted form. And you know, the Lancet launched a really impressive initiative called the Planetary Health Initiative, which has had funding from the Rockefeller Foundation and even has been covered in The Economist. I mean, that's a sure sign that something is becoming mainstream. And the idea of the Planetary Health Initiative is that you simply can't separate human health from planetary health. It's a completely interdependent situation. And if we carry on trashing the health of the planet, then ultimately it will be our demise that comes pretty swiftly.
I think as well that, you know, when we are dealing with things with agency of their own, then who is the designer? You know, that, you know, it changes the relationship between the design and the, you know, the designer themselves. And, you know, are we actually looking at acts of co-constitution, you know, participation, negotiation, diplomacy? Does this, you know, fundamentally change the act of design itself, or does it make it obsolete? Are we looking at some kind of other form of engagement with the living world? So, you know, as the rest of the panel is obviously engaged with, you know, so that actually the things around us flourish, and we flourish along with them.
Yes, thanks for that. Yeah, I think it's highlighting the sort of shift in our relationship. I mean, Michael, you talked about kind of redefining sustainability, and I think it's clear from the set of lectures today about just kind of replacing ourselves within the world, actually, and our relationship to the natural world. I'd just like to pitch that into another question, in that how does this kind of, I mean, I would call it a kind of soft technology in the sense of biotechnology, how does it relate to our kind of hardware, our kind of, a few of you mentioned the idea of sort of robotics. So what do you think there is a relationship between the kind of hard technology that we have as designers, the tools, if you like, and this idea of a kind of more responsive and resilient approach to the natural environment?
I'd love to answer that.
Okay.
I'll keep it quick. But essentially, we're working with the currency of electrons as a shared language, and what that does actually is it obligates a lower energy use for robotics. So these aren't industrial scale, you know, kind of, you know, cyber dogs or again big dog, you know. What you're looking at is actually kind of fragile, intermittent, kind of codependent, choreographed robots so that essentially what you're getting is the transfer of electrons from one system to another as a kind of movement exchange. So, so essentially what's interesting here, though, is that you're starting to look at innovation with low energy constraints. So if you're going to get all your electrons from the process of decomposition, you're probably looking at only 12-volt houses rather than 240-volt houses. But once you make that difference in scale, all of a sudden you've got innovation as to, well, how do I do my washing differently? How do I, refrigerate things differently? Am I looking for new materials? Am I looking for new relationships between hot and cold in a space? So I think these kind of robots, kind of really talking about the relationship between flows of currency that mean something to the machine world and something to the organic world, and it's really interesting how they connect, but they don't connect at these kind of huge scales of differences. The difference between, let's call it, Volta and Galvini. So the organic electricity versus the chemical and industrial electricity, they're kind of such a scale like that. You've got a tsunami going into the organic world. Maybe we can get that kind of co-exchange between two levels of economy in some ways that are more compatible.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. I think it's what's also interesting is you across the panel that you're kind of operating at different scales in some ways, and the kind of toolkit is quite broad as a set of designers and thinkers, and that's opening up new possibilities just in the nature of the way you can collaborate with different people and open up new solutions, if you like. Do you feel this has brought us kind of closer? I mean, it's interesting actually your positions are overall really kind of optimistic and inspiring actually, despite some quite tough sort of data that we have to kind of sort of deal with at the moment. But how do you see some of your ideas being kind of implemented? I thought was also interesting is the idea of kind of time scale and the kind of reactive scale. And again, you're all sort of operating at different scales of kind of turnaround. Perhaps someone would like to kind of comment on that a little bit. We touched upon it, I think, in Helene's discussion, this idea of that we need to be kind of responsive. We're sort of thinking about long-term futures, but also we need to kind of operate quickly in some zones as well. So perhaps I could just open that up for discussion.
Happy to start. I think in terms of the scale and time frame, we are at a time of great urgency, and it is an emergency that we're going through. And I did say in the talk, and Michael Paul also echoed the same idea that we need to move beyond sustainability and into regeneration. We haven't got time to just be sustainable or just be a little bit better. It's time to start healing. It's time to have impact that will reverse the impact that we're having at the moment, rather than just trying to improve things. In terms of if you look at where we really want to be and where we are today, we do have quite a long way, and when you look at it that way, it can be quite disheartening. So I think breaking it down to smaller steps, appreciating that the technology you've got today may not be absolutely perfect, but it will have that impact that will start reversing, that will start the healing, and just starting the implementation as early as possible is absolutely critical. If we were waiting for the perfect material, we'd probably be waiting another 3, 4, 5 years before we launch anything. And we want immediate impact. We want to start, sequestering the carbon tomorrow. We want to start, transforming the conversation immediately, especially within construction, where we're seeing figures actually escalating towards, a more negative picture than a more positive one.
Thanks, Ihab. Yeah, I was kind of interested in this the kind of scale of operation as well, and also how we can kind of open that up. Elaine, you mentioned the idea of kind of open source. I think you mentioned other ideas of actually that can be kind of passed on in some ways, and each of you had some kind of response to that in some way about perhaps empowering people, whether it's through kind of activism, or it's about being included, or it's about taking an idea and being able to kind of repeat it. And in some ways it comes down to kind of designers' ownership and things like that, but also it becomes about whether we can kind of act more quickly if we act together. And I just wondered if anyone would like to kind of add a few thoughts to that. The idea of perhaps these ideas being kind of open and shared beyond our kind of confines sometimes. Yeah. Anyone like to add into that?
I'll give it a go. I'm very interested in the commons of ideas. I mean, and reactivating the commons. You know, again, with the discourse between two forms of finance, the public and private, we've really limited our engagement with ideas about the home and with the commons. In other words, the things we have in commons, the things we can share. And so I think what we're seeing is potentially a kind of cultural and ethical shift towards understanding that if we're going to live along with nature, if we're actually going to be engaged with economy, and we're going to be beneficial, then we need to reactivate the commons. We have to get rid of the tragedy of the commons, and we have to reopen up that space, start to imagine and dream in it, and it will help us work together. So I think we're seeing the symptoms of that.
If I could pick up on that, what Rachel said there is absolutely right. You know, we're a surprisingly story-driven animal. You know, we don't necessarily realize it, but you know, stories are promulgated and they're almost treated as facts. You know, the idea that the commons is tragic has been peddled by right-wing economists for a long time, and it's only really now that we see kind of miracles like Wikipedia, all based on the commons, showing that actually the commons can be and should be creative, and it should be a much bigger section of our economy. And Kate Raworth talks very persuasively about that in her book, Donut Economics. But if I could just pick up on the point about timescales, it's a really tricky time because you know, in some ways we need to be contemplating much deeper timescales. And the fact that politicians regard 2050 as way too far off into the future to really make serious plans about, and yet, you know, my kids will barely be halfway through their lives in 2050. So in some ways we need to be massively extending the timescales over which we're planning. But then there's also the emergency, and you know, and unless we can make really rapid progress at COP26, I'm seriously worried that some people will start to give up hope, and it'll start to become, I won't personally, I carry on fighting forever, but there's a danger that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Maybe also adding to more the open source side, but it actually leads a little bit in the time scale. I think, you know, the essence of science is reproducibility. Is you have to share what you have done to actually prove that it is factual and valid. And I think that it is a very important one. You know, it's only true until it is kind of like you know, proven wrong. And I think for me also, like I see it in a similar way, not only from the molecular side or purely the scientific side, but we're also talking about fairly big ideas where, you know, we have a hypothesis and the theory that this is a better way forward. So I think there's also a way where, you know, if you actually allow it to kind of reproduce it, if you allow other people to kind of look into it, I think it allows us to ultimately move much quicker. Because if we leave it just to ourselves and how it actually would work and what it enables, we will move in a very, very slow, in a very slow, timely manner. So I think if it is really about urgency, I think open source is the only way to go forward to actually make it happen in a relatively short time, but also to kind of like reproduce it and spread it. And I think also the cultural side, that what the beauty is of open source, each culture has a little bit their own way of doing it. There is a beauty, and I always come back to food, right? There's always a reinterpretation of how you work with an ingredient. And I think that is also the case for a product or for an industry as well. You have to make it suitable for a particular location or for a particular culture. And I think the open source aspect really allows you to do that and to kind of like share that experience.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I think maybe that could lead into perhaps our final topic of conversation for this evening, so we have the shared response, we have a shared resource that we need to accelerate our response to, and we agree with all our speakers, hence why we've arranged this event this evening. And bringing it back to the provocation of tonight, that COVID offers an opportunity, doesn't it? It offers us an opportunity to address some of these issues. And one of the things I wonder about, given that this is a part of a university talk, is the role that the students might play in that, and the students being the designers of tomorrow. And I really encourage our students, or we as a staff team really encourage our students to try and drive their design responses to the very edge of what they think is possible. And I think that's why we invited the four of you this evening, because that's exactly what you're doing. So I just wondered, as a final way of rounding up this evening, whether people might want to offer some advice or any thoughts about how the students might go about incorporating some of these ideas, or how they might drive these agendas forward with what they're interested in. Because I just think that'd be a really nice way of kind of concluding what we've been talking about.
Yeah, if I may actually start on that. I think it's a really critical point that you made, Michael, about the stories that we've learned to believe and that we've built our economies and our lives around. There's never been a time in modern history where the stories that we've all learned to believe so deeply have been so questioned, and I think it's a really exciting and interesting time to be a student and to be graduating into this world where there's so much opportunity for transformation and for change. We touched a little bit on open source and IP, and I think that's a huge barrier for innovation. We started from a place of wanting to open source our technologies and make it available to everyone. We found ourselves very quickly in the construction industry surrounded by sharks, and that was just not really an option. If we really wanted to make an impact, if we really wanted to get anywhere, we had to protect our technologies. But we protected them in a way that allowed us to choose who we open source it to, and we open sourced it to communities who can benefit directly from it. We offer a 50% profit share, and that way you're able to actually take control of the economy within which you're working. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you're a student and you're coming out into this sort of harsh world of business, or the economies that have been built for the last 30-40 years, it's really important to never stop questioning and challenging, and you will always find a way around the way things are built at the moment, because they're all built on stories, and stories can be changed.
Shall I go next? There are two things really. One is an anecdote about when Peter Smithson was interviewed for the job of running the Architectural Association, and the idea he pitched to them was that in the first year students would redesign the world, because when you're 18 you can. In the second year you design a city. In the third year you design a major public building. In the fourth year you design a house, and in the fifth year you detail it. And in some ways I think that is a pretty good model. We need to encourage students to really zoom out and look at a planetary scale, because ultimately we've got to find a way to integrate everything that we do as humans into a long-term sustaining system. And then the second thing I wanted to say was about possibilism. So often people kind of talk about whether you're optimistic or pessimistic, and the trouble with that is they both imply a sense of inevitability about the future, which is, in my view, incorrect. And it's better to adopt a possibilist mindset where you decide on the future you want and you set about creating it. And what we've really got to do is find ways to maximize our agency. I see within the construction industry agency minimization all over the place. Architects say, well, there's not much we can do unless we've got a client that wants a sustainable building. the architectural press say, well, you know, we can only cover the stories that people want to read. And even big developers say, well, you know, we can only do what our shareholders demand. And it's time to call that out as BS, because, you know, that leads to a really bleak future. But the good news is that if we choose to do the opposite, if we each seek to maximize our own agency, then it encourages others to do the same. And we need that to spread as a kind of viral movement. Awkward metaphor, I know, but there is a real chance that if we all maximize our agency, we can achieve radical change in a very short space of time.
Yeah, I'd like to say that the future isn't invented. It's written and rewritten every day, and that's done through, you know, your ideas, taking them for the walk and experimenting with them, taking them into extreme environments and seeing how they respond, and you know, seeing how those different ideas kind of start to stick together. Because I like to think about the kind of task ahead of us is not really about designing a building or a solution or a product or a set of materials. It's actually the practice of worlding and re-worlding the world, so that we're not looking at things in isolation, but we can look through details. Maybe, as Bruce Sterling says, the diegetic object, which kind of references a much larger reality. And so by thinking through detail, you can actually conjure forth a set of different worlded possibilities. And I think it becomes a very powerful tool for storytelling. So I think, you know, we're all pretty much saying the same thing from different different perspectives, but essentially that the power is yours. And if you ally yourself with agents that redistribute their power through you, you can be, you know, much more effective together.
I think that seems like a really great place to end things tonight. I think that's a wonderful conclusion. I think we've had a great evening, 4 fantastic speakers full of inspiration, hope, ingenuity, passion. So I'd like to personally thank all of our speakers for giving up their time this evening, helping to create what has been an excellent event. I really appreciate it. We really appreciate it. And you're well deserving of a virtual round of applause, which is something that we're going to currently miss, aren't we, with the online digital forum of the future. I think we need to invent a form of clapping. But yeah, thanks very much. And also, thank you to everyone that's joined us tonight. We've had over 250 people have tuned in to watch this. So staff, students, alumni, professionals, friends. I really hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. So thanks to everybody. Video recording of tonight's proceedings will be available shortly, and we'll get it uploaded onto our school website. I also can download all the question and answers that people have submitted, which we maybe haven't had time to answer. And I'll seek to get some responses to a few more of those from the speakers and upload those responses if we can. So yeah, a final thank you from me. Does any speakers have any final thoughts, or are we happy to conclude it there? Great.
Thanks for involving us. Well done. Great.
Thank
event.
you so much.
Thanks so much. It makes such a difference to have speakers of such quality at events like this. So yeah, thank you to all 4 of you. Thank you to everyone that took part, and have a good evening. Take care. Take care of yourselves. Take care of everyone else.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Thanks a lot. Bye now.
Cheers.